Mesdames, Messieurs, bonjour ou rebonjour pour celles et ceux qui étaient en notre compagnie ce matin. Nous sommes cet après-midi donc au sein ici de l'amphithéâtre Raoul Castex. On est ravis de vous accueillir. On poursuit évidemment nos échanges avec une réflexion autour de la souveraineté, comme vous le savez. Et nous allons voir comment le renseignement en constitue l'un des piliers. Aujourd'hui, détenir une capacité de renseignement ne suffit plus. Encore faut-il en maintenir l'excellence et en corriger les failles. C'est toute la réflexion justement à laquelle nous invite notre première séquence de cet après-midi. Alors, quelles sont les causes les plus fréquentes des failles et des erreurs en matière de renseignement? Comment y remédier, bien évidemment? Élément de réponse en compagnie de notre prochain panel avec Clément Renault, Philippe Silberzahn, Bjørn, Grønning et Lomas. Vous pouvez les applaudir. Merci pour eux.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure for me as Director of the Intelligence College in Europe to be here again in this Paris Defense and Security Forum 2026. The College in Europe, established on a French initiative in March 2019, has contributed since 2024 to the PDSF in its domain of competence, the European intelligence and security culture. The role of the College is to create bridges between the nearly 100 European intelligence and security services, bridges between the academics and the intelligence community, and to contribute through some outreach actions to create bridges with the European institutions. It does it thanks to 32 training sessions and events, plus this year in June with a true high-value and high-level academic conference with the first ever European award for intelligence studies. The main goal of the Intelligence College is not only to train intelligence officers in a multinational format, but also to strengthen a common European intelligence and security culture. Last year, in the PDSF, the Intelligence College had a keynote speech on the renewed strategic intelligence needs for the Europeans due to the geopolitical revolution, delivered by Dr. Gerard Conrad, the Intelligence Senior Advisor of the Munich Security Conference, and a very dynamic roundtable on the interactions between youth and the intelligence community. This year, I am proud to offer this main intelligence sequence of the Paris Defense Security Forum and to introduce this roundtable on a difficult but very interesting topic, the intelligence failures. This is typically the type of subjects where academics from different domains and countries mix with academics having worked in the intelligence community could provide us very useful lessons learned. Without further ado, I give the floor to our moderator, Dr. Clément Renault from IRSEM, the French MOD think tank, which has just joined our Intelligence College academic network, which is strong of 47 institutions, and who himself has written on the 7th October failure. À toi, mon cher Clément.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, François. Good morning to you all. I'm really happy to moderate and share this panel. Thank you to all the panelists to be here and to have traveled across Europe to join us today. I will briefly introduce each of you before we move into our round table. On my left, I have Dr. Bjørn Grønning, who is Deputy Research Director at the Norwegian Intelligence School and Deputy Head of its Center for Intelligence Studies. Bjørn is both a practitioner of intelligence and an academic studying intelligence. Bjørn has spent his postgraduate career serving in various Norwegian positions, including a senior advisor at the Norwegian Defense Staff, a senior advisor at the Norwegian National Security Authority, and a senior research fellow at the Norwegian Defense University. And recently you edited and published a volume entitled Intelligence Warning Cases, Learning from Successes and Failures. It's an important contribution to the literature on intelligence failure, and I do advise you to turn towards this book after this discussion. Philippe, welcome. Philippe Silberzahn is professor of EmLyon Business School. He also teaches at HEC Paris. He has authored and co-authored 5 books in French and English, among which for this discussion today is Constructing Cassandra, Reframing Intelligence Failure, which is a study of intelligence failures by the CIA from 1947 to 2001. You have more than 20 years of industry experience as an entrepreneur and CEO, and thank you again for joining us for this conversation. And lastly, we have Dan Lomas, who's assistant professor in international relations at University of Nottingham. He was previously senior lecturer in intelligence studies at Brunel University London. And Dan has published extensively about intelligence, and he's currently working on a very interesting piece of work for Georgetown University Press, which will be sort of latest history of SIS and MI6. And recently you published a secret history of UK vetting from 1909 to the present. So thank you again for joining us. So to move on to today's discussion, I would be interested because intelligence failure is quite a widely discussed topic in the intelligence literature. And somehow this is also where the intelligence fail started, trying to understand for intelligence organizations where and how they failed. So I would be interested for all of you to maybe just give us a brief detail of how you address the issue of intelligence failure in your own work. Bjørn, if you want to start.
Thank you very much. So, as Clément mentioned, I come from the Norwegian Intelligence School, where I research and direct research on behalf of the school. In 2022, we rebranded the school, and on that occasion, we established a dedicated research effort. And we had to figure out what is going to be our first and flagship research effort. So we figured we need something that's really important, we need something that is researchable, and we need something that is operationally relevant. Hence we decided on doing a large research project on intelligence warning. So our approach to intelligence failures is intelligence warning from the research side. And what do we mean by intelligence warning? Well, we focus on threats towards national interest, future threats, not threats that are necessarily in the present. We focus on contemporary issues, well, relatively contemporary. In our research, we have our first case study from 2006, going up until 2022, 2023. We have a relatively broad threat conception, figuring that most of the literature on intelligence warning is largely historic. So we wanted to see if we could learn something new by addressing relatively modern cases of intelligence warning. And we also saw that a lot of the literature is focused on the US and the UK. So we wanted to broaden the geographic scope of our study. So we also have cases from Norway, of course, Pakistan, Syria, France, and other countries as well. Finally, we wanted to do something collaborative. We wanted to draw on the strengths of researchers out there internationally, so we decided upon doing a edited volume where we drew in 13 or 14 researchers from across the world to help us develop this project.
Thank you very much. Philippe?
Yes, I actually come from the business world, and the reason the book was written was that I actually had a friend who was working on intelligence failure, and he was telling me about the book, and I was really struck by the fact that although he was strictly working on intelligence agencies, I told him that, you know, everything you talk about, I see the same mechanism in the business world, in that, you know, you have to understand the world, spot when something is new, and we call that disruption and innovation. The words are different, but the mechanisms are the same. Why is it that an organization fails to anticipate a development in its field, in its environment, that it should have been able to anticipate and act upon? So that was really the starting point, and it was really striking that there are some mechanisms that cut across organizations, regardless of whether they are intelligence agencies, startups, large organizations, governments, and so on. So we try to look at that. And so the focus is really on the organization. What are the organizational mechanisms? We talk about sociology of knowledge, because we see the intelligence as a product that goes through, you know, the initial tasking, the change, the collection, and so on and so on. So it's really like a process, and we can see that at every step of this process there can be a disruption, which leads to a failure. And perhaps the second thing is that we didn't just look at threats, because I think an intelligence failure is not necessarily, or at least not just the ability to identify a threat, It can also failing to identify an opportunity. So it's much more general. And number two is not just an event, because some of those failures sort of span across many years. And so that's why you have to come back to the mechanism and ask, why is it that some questions don't get asked? So that was really the starting point.
Thank you very much. Dan, how do you approach this issue?
I'm going to really later on question the notion of intelligence failure, which seems weird for a panel on intelligence failure. But thinking about this, one major issue that crops up is the interface between intelligence and policy. And I think there are real problems around intelligence officials conveying uncertainty to policymakers. So the headline figure 2001 was Bin Laden determined to strike the US. Okay, well, where, when, how are the major questions, I think, from the policy perspective. And I think that it's a problem of both sides. Conveying uncertainty to senior figures when they want certainty is a real problem. But on the other side of the coin, presidents, prime ministers, senior ministers do want that element of certainty which intelligence can never provide. I also think, however, there's also this bigger problem of intelligence irrelevance, where some of the events we're seeing, for example, now, if it's trying to draw on some of the leaks we're seeing in the US press, suggests that despite great collection assets out there, US intelligence is having little influence on what's happening in the White House at the moment, and that leads to this policy irrelevance dimension, I think. I think another thing that crops up, and again, I'm drawing on kind of things that I recall as a child, listening to Donald Rumsfeld in 2002 speak about the unknown unknowns. And I think there's always, in the age of open source, in the digital age, there's always this idea that somehow we can collect more information, it will lead to better assessment, it will lead to better policy outcomes. And my argument is that the AI slop you see out there, the digital access to information actually increases uncertainty, and I think this issue of failure, collection and analytical failure will remain ongoing despite the large amount of information that we see. And I think finally, looking at intelligence failures and the response of governments and officials to these, I think that hindsight is a brilliant thing. Most people become experts at intelligence assessment after the event, when you can easily connect the dots together. And I think that one of the real problems of getting to the nub of why intelligence fails is hindsight bias heavily shapes what we know at the time. And if we're looking at, we can talk maybe afterwards about NATO-wide assessments of what was going to happen in Ukraine, but one of the assessments was that why would Putin invade Ukraine? Because it would decimate his military, it would lead to horrific casualties. And that was, I think, a correct assessment to make at the time. Russia's armed forces has been significantly degraded by what we're seeing in the battlefield of Ukraine. But I think analysts got it wrong for the right reasons, if you know what I'm saying there.
Thank you. You actually did touch upon a couple of things that we're going to get into during this conversation. But the main point here is, what exactly do we call an intelligence failure? As you did describe, most of the time this term is used retrospectively to qualify an intelligence failure. But what is it exactly? How would you all use this term? You said intelligence warning. How would you define intelligence warning versus intelligence failure? And what's the difference?
Well, I suspect I might have a bit of a dissenting view here. I tend to look at intelligence failure as a broader phenomenon of which intelligence warning failure is a subset. So when we're talking about warning, you're talking about something, detecting something that's going to happen in the future. You're trying to detect a threat that has not yet materialized in order to allow decision makers enough time to prepare and mobilize countermeasures, or as you would say, to give them time to mobilize measures to exploit an opportunity, right? So the thing that you are trying to figure out happens in the future, not in the present or in the past. And if that thing you're trying to figure out is a threat or an opportunity, then we are in the realm of intelligence warning. Intelligence failures as such, the broader phenomenon, could be about anything that intelligence is trying to figure out. It could be about misinforming decision makers about the personal profile of a foreign leader, that would be an intelligence failure, not necessarily an intelligence warning failure. So this is how I see intelligence failure as a more broad term than intelligence warning.
Thank you. Philippe, in your book, you're covering quite a wide period of time, from 1947 to 2001. So is intelligence failure best understood as sort of be defined narrowly, focused specifically on specific events or a set of specific events, or should it be defined more broadly as a recurring feature of intelligence organizations?
That's the focus we take on, because there is the discussion of failure because of a difficulty of communication between the intelligence and the decision maker. I think one of the intelligence experts some time back said the salesmanship is part of the game. You have to sell the decision maker things that they don't want to hear, basically. And that's part of the game. So you were talking about influence, and you can have a lot of information, and if you don't have influence to the decision maker, it's going to be a failure. But we don't really cover that one. We really work sort of prior to that, when the organization itself, even before its ability to convey this influence, even before that, is surprised. And so what we look at is, first of all, it's not always either threat or opportunity. It's actually any development. If you think about the fall of the USSR, was it a threat? Was it an opportunity? Maybe a bit of both. So it was just a development which we knew would have a major impact, but it was largely unanticipated. So really the question is that you're dealing with events that span many years, because we could spend 2 days discussing when did the USSR fall. Some people say, well, right from the beginning, it wasn't viable. Okay, so 1917, game over, it's just a matter of how long it's going to take for. Or some people say, no, it's Ronald Reagan, 1984, and well, okay, we'll not discuss that. But you're dealing with very long-term processes. And what is really striking is that you have, I define intelligence failure essentially as an erroneous assessment of a development. And what is really striking is that those erroneous assessments went again and again over decades. And the USSR is a case in point, but we could also talk about the Iranian Revolution, where again, you're talking about something that the rise of religion practice moves to the middle class in Iran in the mid-60s. You just look at the number of mosques that were built. And so you're looking at processes that cross decades. And so then you're back to the organization, and you really need to understand how is it that some questions were not asked, the wrong puzzle, and some information was distracted. So again, the process itself of the organization.
Dan, do you think that, based on what Philippe said, intelligence failure is actually a useful analytical concept, or is it more, or has it turned more into sort of a political or rhetorical label that can be used to blame intelligence organizations after the events?
So I do think it is a useful framing device from an academic perspective, and we saw that post-Iraq, post-Butler. We saw this focus, particularly on analytical rigor, as a way of overcoming intelligence failure. So I think that certainly, from an academic perspective, there is an element of this. And there are individual case studies where you can pick out. Iraq was the prime example of misleading assessments that shaped policy and vice versa. And there are things that stand out as intelligence failure. I also think, however, that, and I'm attacking my own academic community and colleagues here, is that we're relatively fast to focus on failure. We're relatively slow to actually focus on intelligence success stories and to try and learn the lessons of what went right in order to replicate that going forward. But there is also every terror attack you see in the UK, or every single foreign policy crisis we're currently seeing, there is always a focus from the media and some politicians, in particular, to say the intelligence agencies failed. I think the collapse of the pro-Western government in Afghanistan was a classic example of politicians blaming the community for not warning them in enough time that this was going to happen. And of course, Western intelligence could point to various intelligence assessments saying that, look, we were warning you about the fragility of the regime in Kabul, and you didn't need our intelligence assessments to see kind of what was going wrong. You could watch in real time on X and other social media platforms to see that. And I do see that one of the major problems, and one of the things I'm constantly shouting about on social media, our journalists that for lazy shorthand will say the intelligence agencies somehow failed every time, for example, a terrorist incident might happen in the UK. And I think that it's lazy shorthand at times, and it overlooks the fact that this is complicated for a whole range of factors.
Bjørn, you wanted to add something to it.
Yeah, you kind of put a coin on me when you asked the question about if warning failure or intelligence failure is something that decision makers use to accuse intelligence of being at fault. I reject the premise because the purpose of intelligence and intelligence warning is not to detect a threat. It's to do something about it. And it's the decision makers who have to do something about it. So they own half the problem. And some will argue that it is the responsibility of intelligence to convince decision makers that they are right. To a certain extent, I believe that, but it's not black and white. Decision makers bear responsibility for the relationship with their intelligence services, and they bear responsibility for the decisions that they make. They own half the problem. So I think intelligence could accuse decision makers of the same. Thank you.
You did mention then that we ourselves have a bias as academics when we study intelligence failures, because we can only study intelligence failures somehow, because there are those that provide, news, press releases, lots of fuss in the media, and of course archives. But intelligence successes remain secret in many ways. So that's also kind of a bias in the way that we assess the sources that we have in our hands. In the end, intelligence analysis is somehow the art of making sense of secretly accessed information to help decision making. Yet the information collected rarely speak for themselves, despite the secret capacities that intelligence organizations may have. So how do assumptions and the analytic tradecraft and the prior beliefs can actually influence the interpretation of ambiguous information that intelligence organizations and analysts collect?
Thank you. I think it's an interesting question to make. I mean, Richard Betts, the American scholar, referred to the enemies of intelligence, and one of the enemies, of course, was the inherent enemies within the mind of an individual analyst or of an analytical team dealing with a particular problem. And I think that there's a lot out there about how individual mindsets shape perception. There's a lot of our upbringing, our education, the colleagues we have around us shape the way we think about the broader world around us, and the mind often plays significant tricks on us. I think there's also a broader problem here of we're prisoners of the past, essentially. So one of the big problems of Iraq, and sorry, it's always Iraq, is that Saddam did have WMD and used them against Kurdish population, and he had a long history of hiding certain things, and that prehistory shaped the mind of many of the analysts in dealing with the Iraqi WMD problem in 2002, 2003 there. So I think there's always that inherent enemies within both the mind that impact on this. And there's also this broader mindset that sometimes it's very difficult to put ourselves in the mindset of how a totalitarian dictator is thinking. How does someone who lives in a modern-day liberal democracy put themselves in the mindset of Vladimir Putin? How do you put yourself in the mindset of President Xi and others? And there have been multiple examples throughout history where individuals and analytical teams have not put themselves in the mindset of the other side and have adopted this mirror imaging and have tried to explain particular patterns in information they're seeing away as something else. So in 1968, for example, the Soviets are not going to crush the Prague Spring because why would they? Because it would affect their diplomatic standing, whereas in reality the analysts should have put themselves in the mindset of, yes, this is something so existential to Moscow, they will intervene. Equally, the Ukraine crisis, there were some examples where European and indeed some officials in the UK and US also believed that why would Putin do this, because this would be a mad thing to do, and they didn't put themselves in the mindset of Moscow's calculus.
It is in the literature one of the main factors that is always put forward in terms of explaining the failure, which is analytical and assessment and analytical tradecraft. And the case of the 7 October is interesting in this regard, because among the various factors that played out, lots of great intelligence was actually being collected by the Israeli Defense Forces and by the Shin Bet. But how did they make sense of that intelligence? They had the plan, they had technological capacity, they had a lot of SIGINT and imagery, and yet they had a lot of flaws in the way that they were interpreting the collection, the intelligence that they had, actually misinterpreting not only the intentions but the capabilities as well, despite their access. So analysis is, of course, somehow in the picture of intelligence failure in the case of 7 October. But in other cases, it's not primarily analysis. It might actually be other factors of intelligence failure. And maybe I turn to you, Philippe, about the organizational factors. Because, after all, intelligence organizations are intelligence bureaucracies. They work as bureaucracies. They have silos, they have layers, they have managers, they have interpersonal relationships, all of these things that characterize the sociology of knowledge, conditions for the production of a specific knowledge. So how can organizational aspects can actually play out into the picture of building an intelligence failure or making it possible?
Yeah, it is a product, so it goes through the different stages of the organization. And if we look at the sociology of knowledge, just to take one example, if you take 1962 and Cuba, for instance. Cuba at that time is not considered as an important country by the US. So it's an annoying country, because they've gone communist and they're not far from us, so it's really annoying. But who could care about a country where there is no mineral, there's no petrol, there's just cigars and sugar? So it cannot have a strategic importance. So Cuba there is some surveillance, but it's largely routine, because it cannot be strategically important. And then if you look from the Russian angle, Cuba is enormously important, because it is a symbol of a revolution that can happen. It's, to my knowledge, the only country that went communist by itself. And so it is seen by the Russian, who, contrary to the West, know that their system is in big trouble in the 1960s. And there are quotes of Russian generals who basically say, with Cuba, we could believe again. And so there is this bizarre sort of, trips from Russia to Cuba, where these old generals from the Second World War go and see the youngsters being revolutionary and say, oh, we can believe it again. So a massive symbolic importance. And of course, there's the importance that if you have ballistic missiles so close to the US, and because you believe that your system is not going to make it, that your only chance of balancing the power is to have missiles, because the economy is not going to work. So there is a massive difference of interpretation from the US and from the Russia on the very importance of a specific topic. Now, what does it mean in the sort of day-to-day life of an organization? Where if there is a meeting with the president, you're not going to bring Cuba as number one, because it is, it's annoying. And in the spring of '62, they start having this traffic, and we know something's going on with those trucks and so on. But it cannot be really important. So in the meeting with the president is going to be item number 4 or 5, and maybe the president is going to have to leave before we reach to number 5. That's the life of the organization. So it's really the organization. So it is not just biases like the heat of the moment where we miss something or groupthink, although of course that plays a role. It's going to know why is a question being only seen as minor, whereas it should be major. So it's really the complete process of the organization.
It's also maybe in the cases of intelligence assessments that can be made by a group of analysts, while at the same time in the way that the analytical product travels through the bureaucracy can actually also be changed by managers, by higher-ups in the hierarchy that see the assessment differently. And all of the things that can actually play out in making an assessment that comes to the top, eventually being altered by some organizational processes that eventually do not necessarily produce or ends up providing the assessment to policymakers. So all of these factors can play as well from a bureaucratic point of view?
When you have to produce a report, you have to agree with your colleagues on what's going to go into the report. And in the specific case of the CIA, there is a culture of consensus. Well, consensus is very powerful, except in extreme situations. Okay, so in normal situations, consensus will allow you to avoid mistakes. In extreme situations, it will cut from extreme assessment. So the very fact that, and the CIA has to agree with, I think, 16 different agencies. And so there is, for instance, a big issue in the assessment of the USSR in 1989, where the Department of Commerce refused that some conclusion go into a report because it doesn't fit with their assessment of the situation. So an essential assessment doesn't go into the report because there's no consensus, and we need a consensus before we go to the president. So that's a very typical example of this bureaucratic process, not in a negative term, I have to say, because there has to be a process. We call it bureaucratic with a negative tone, but there has to be a process. By the way, it's the same in commercial organizations, of course. You need to agree before you go to see the boss. Otherwise, the boss is going to say, well, that's a mess. And you don't want that for your career.
And on the other hand, trying to build up offices to institutionalize dissent inside an organization is not something that is easy either, and that no organization wants. Although CIA has created a red cell after 2001 to try to institutionalize red teaming and techniques of to actually challenge main assumptions. But it
cannot be good for your career if you're the guy who
exactly.
always disagrees.
So that creates other types of...
Sociology should say, don't do that. Yes. Or don't be that person.
So we've talked about analytical tradecraft, we've talked about organizations and bureaucracy, but of course sometimes assessment of failures inside intelligence organizations sometimes lead to what you were mentioning earlier, Dan, which is if we had had more intelligence, better intelligence, greater access, whether in SIGINT or humans or whatever, we might have seen it coming. So most of the time one of this underlying assessment of why intelligence failed is lack of collection or the need to actually give or develop greater access. How much of an issue do you think this really is, Bjørn? Do you think that most of the time, because it's the job of intelligence organizations to have secret access and to collect specific information, that collection is really kind of a thing, or is that among the other factors that played out, it's something that is equal to other factors in the way that intelligence organizations work and do their business?
For intelligence warning to succeed, there's a host of things that must be in place. There's a longer list, but if we sort of distill it a little bit, there needs to be information available. You need to collect that information, you need to correctly analyze that information, and you need to disseminate that information in a way that makes your decision maker respond to it. Now, full disclaimer, we have 15 case studies in our research, so it is by no means good grounds for statistical conclusions, but we do see that in none of the cases is the lack of information the key issue. Analysis, dissemination, response, receptivity, the willingness of the decision maker to receive, believe, and react to the warning that they have been issued. That's where the problems are in the selection of cases that we have. We have a French case in our book, which was written by Dr. Pauline Blisten about the terrorist attacks across Paris in 2015, was it, November?
Yes.
And her conclusion is that the French bodies, government agencies responsible for detecting this threat had a staggering amount of information available to them. But they did not arrive at an analysis that told them that something big was about to happen. Now, admittedly, this information was scattered across several intelligence law enforcement organs. So the problem in this case, one of the problems was that the deficiencies in their ability to coordinate and share to establish a holistic picture of the intelligence upon which they were sitting. So more information is always better, but only if you can distinguish the good information from the misinformation, the bad information, the disinformation. So the more you collect, the more you have to sift through. And I don't believe that it necessarily gives you better odds for arriving at a successful intelligence warning.
That's very interesting, because when we discuss with intelligence officers, it's sometimes something that they tend to think. Better access will provide better information and better assessment. So we've talked about all these aspects actually from the bureaucratic point of view, or from intelligence organizations' point of view. But as Christopher Andrew, the historian of intelligence, once wrote, intelligence is only as good as the use that is made of it by policymakers. So you can have great intelligence, great assessments, right assessments about the threats. But if policymakers do not want to act upon it, this will simply make no sense. And in the end, intelligence is only made to shed light for decision making. So how much of a factor the relationship, or what is sometimes called the intelligence policy nexus, so the relationship between intelligence and policymakers, how much of a factor is it when it comes to intelligence failures in general? For all of you, Dan, if you want to start.
One of the things I always tell students in class when they take an intelligence module thinking it's going to be sexy and we're going to talk about spies and we're going to talk about covert action and we're going to talk about lots of killing and all that sort of stuff and Bond-like escapades, is to turn around in week one and say, look, intelligence is really good, it's really important, but in the broader policy-making context, we need to kind of look at where intelligence sits. And, you know, we all like intelligence, we're all here listening to an intelligence panel, but you know, the Prime Minister or the President is also being influenced by other sources of information out there. They're often thinking about, you know, advice from their Foreign Secretary, from open source or diplomatic reporting. You're also factoring in maybe what your own constituents are thinking back at home. You're also factoring in broader economic policy, broader political party issues within your own political party. So intelligence, you know, is not necessarily seen as the be-all and end-all, and this is why it's important for intelligence officials to flag up why what they bring to the table is new, you know, to flag up the value added that they're providing that the open source doesn't necessarily bring. And I think one of the real problems, and we're seeing this in the United States, is that intelligence, you know, the ODNI, the CIA providing important intelligence assessments to the White House, but you're now competing with a 24-hour news media. You know, you can see when President Trump may or may not be receiving intelligence assessments by when he's putting stuff out on Truth Social. You can see clearly kind of what types of things are influencing the president these days through kind of what the misinformation out there, kind of various chat forums that he's interested in, all these types of things. So I think one of the real problems today is that, yes, intelligence having cut through at the policy level has always been an issue, but in today's world, when you can literally put on CNN, France 24, BBC News and watch things in real time, is that kind of cut through, and what value added does intelligence bring to the table there? And I think that's one of the big issues.
And what you say, what I hear, is that somehow policymakers are intelligence analysts themselves, but they might be caught in the same biases and problems that intelligence analysts are, and the best of the world, trained to actually face. Policymakers are not always trained to face those biases that they may face while receiving various sources of information from the various bureaucracies, be it intelligence organizations, foreign affairs, defense departments. So they also find themselves making arbitration on these different sources of information. How do you view this relationship, Philippe, about organizations? And what's the good relationship to build between an organization and policymakers?
As always, salesmanship is part of the job. Allow me to draw a parallel with the business world. When Nespresso was launched, the market research was a disaster. Nobody wanted Nespresso. When they asked people, you know, everybody said, well, you know, I don't need an espresso at home. I have a coffee filter, and you know, I don't need it. It was a disaster. And they launched the product, and everybody bought it, and it's a killer. And so what they want is not always what they need, and what they need is not always what they ask for. So if you limit yourself, and I think one of the things you learn when you deal with a client, I don't like the term in the specific term of intelligence service, but with the policymaker is, you know, your key asset is access to the policymaker and the fact that he has confidence in you. That's probably the only asset, and it's very simple. If you ask for a meeting, you know, how long do you need until you actually have the meeting? And that if you're a good, you know, head of intelligence, that's really the only metric that really matters. Plus the fact that you tell the decision maker some interesting things, of course. And so the problem is that you have to bring issues that they don't want to hear about. You know, there is this notion of the president as the client. And so when there is a new president, the CIA comes to see the president-elect and says, "Hi, Mr. President, what are your priorities?" And, you know, with Bill Clinton, there was a list of priorities at that time. It was a nuclear proliferation, there was a traffic of human trafficking and so on. And I think terrorism was like, you know, number 7 or 8 and so on. So, well, that was the priority of the client, and therefore terrorism was de facto not a priority. And so if you are purely reacting to the demand of the customer, then it's very dangerous. And any good innovator would tell you that, well, you know, I don't react to what they ask now. I try to anticipate what they will ask in a few years, and I need to be ready when they ask for that. So you cannot just be, there was this expression, I don't remember who mentioned it, but you cannot just be a weather forecast. Oh, is it going to be sunny tomorrow? Let me check. Yes, it's going to be sunny. Thank you very much. And then you get it right or wrong. Is that you have to anticipate the question that the decision maker is going to ask you in a hurry at 3 in the morning, in 3 months or in 3 years. So you have to anticipate the client need. It's common in business. Okay, you just don't respond to what the customer asks today. You anticipate what they want, or you think they will ask in a few years' time.
Bjørn, do you want to?
Nothing to add to that.
No. What is interesting in providing assessment and in the relationship between intelligence and policymakers is that intelligence can be used by policymakers for different outcomes or for different purposes than only assessment. And the case of the war launched against Iran is an interesting case in how Donald Trump is using his intelligence community. The CIA, especially, is clearly at the forefront and present. John Radcliffe is at the forefront of the operation. However, the assessments made, apparently, from what has been made public, of Iranians' capabilities of accessing a bomb and the intentions of Ayatollah Khomeini to actually build the bomb was, for many years, not the assessment of the CIA was that the Iranian was not getting close to having that bomb. However, this assessment, this judgment was not used, but the operational capabilities of the CIA to have access inside the Iranian regime to specific sources so that they could actually conduct the operations is how intelligence is being used. So assessment is one thing. On the other side, operations is another one. And this is also something that is interesting in how, for instance, John Radcliffe is also maybe trying to push forward the role of the CIA in the US apparatus, not for assessment, but rather for operational capabilities. Philippe, you did mention that we do come out of 20 years of counterterrorism. And in many ways, counterterrorism and what it requires in terms of access to specific sources, in terms of the flow of intelligence, the sharing of intelligence, has shaped contemporary intelligence organizations. However, with the strategic complexity that we are growingly facing right now, we can see that intelligence organizations are also reforming. The BND, for instance, is changing and reforming itself, or on the verge of reforming itself. French intelligence organizations have also reformed themselves in the last few years. The CIA in 2015 under John Brennan transformed its organization in mission centers. So this reform isn't going in many intelligence organizations, but how important is it for intelligence bureaucracies to reform their organizations? And how do we make sure, while doing these reforms, that we are not actually paving the way for the dysfunctions and the future intelligence failures?
Well, the good thing with reform is that they keep consultants very busy, and it's very entertaining. And you can do a lot of PowerPoints, and it gives the impression that you're doing something. I think if organizational reform was useful, we would know it by now. And I think the Israeli had reorganized their services on the model of Americans who just had been surprised, and they did that right before the Kippur War. So I think it doesn't mean that sometimes you should not reform a little bit, but the point is, what do you reform? And I think what we see in this world is the rapidly shifting, what I call models, fundamental models, and that's, I think, where we should focus. The point is not that, I teach organizational strategy, and there is always this idea that somewhere there is an ideal organizational form, and if we look enough, like Easter eggs, somewhere we will find the perfect organization. I can share a secret with you here, is that, if there was an ideal organizational setting, we would know by now. And so it's either too centralized or too decentralized, and when you're too centralized, you criticize because it's a mess, then you re-centralize, and then you criticize because nothing can move, and you go by circle, and again, only the consultant make money in the story. So the real point is really being able to question the very models on which we see the world. And that's what we've seen, especially in the last few years, and the last few months, and even the last few weeks, because many of the things that we see are really so against models that have been true for many. I mean, come on, we came close to a war with the US, for God's sake. It's like, if I had told you that, last year, we would have said, no, Philippe, come on, be serious. So the real challenge is that the world is moving so fast and so deeply and so profoundly that the shifting of model for me is really the key issue. Otherwise, we will keep being surprised by people who, surprise has been the essence of military action for 5,000 years. And that's the idea. So if we need to be able to shift models very quickly and challenge our models, because to me, that's the essence of surprise. And you were talking about data, and of course, I know if more data would make us more intelligent, again, we would know by now. Now, more data. I was reminded of a quote by the patron saint of signal to noise, Roberta Wohlstetter, in the case of Pearl Harbor. And she said in the run-up to Pearl Harbor, the condition of data collection were close to ideal. It wasn't a question of data. It was that the US were absolutely convinced that doing what the Japanese did was physically impossible. Number one. Number two, that yes, the Japanese Marine was making progress, but the way they were making progress would mean that to reach Pearl Harbor would take another 10 years. They forgot to notice that the progress were now exponential, and they made more progress in the last 2 years running up to the war than over the previous 10 years. Again, it's a failure of model. It wasn't a problem of data. It was a problem of the meaning we give to the data. There's no data with model to interpret the data. So we are back to what are your models?
Thank you. You did mention that intelligence failures are indeed, and strategic surprise is indeed a feature of military history. But Bjørn, in the edited volume that you directed, focusing on the 15 cases that you mentioned, you are focusing on contemporary cases. How different are those cases, contemporary cases, to those that the historical literature has documented over the years?
Well, I wish I had something revolutionary to bring to the table, but I'm afraid I do not. I'm glad you introduced Roberta Wohlstetter, so I don't have to, because we see a lot of the same things. What we see across the cases of intelligence warning that fail is that it's never one cause. It's a complex set of issues that makes intelligence warning very, very challenging. And the causes that keep recurring in different constellations are bias, it's information overload, it's politicization, it is trouble in terms of cooperating and coordinating across services, and it is decision-maker mistrust in its intelligence services. So these are things that we have seen in the literature before, and I think that when we broaden the scope of the study, we look at new cases, more contemporary cases, and adopt a broader conception of threats, and we find the same results. I think we have stronger results than we had before. What I would say, though, is that I think that in the world that we are living in today, some of these very traditional issues are becoming more difficult. Politicization, look at the world that we're living in today. Is it more difficult or less difficult than it was 20 years ago? I'd say it's more. Information overload, it's getting exponentially more challenging. The mission portfolio of many intelligence services is broadening, so you have to look at a broader set of issues and you have to prioritize. Something is going to slip. And then you have the not new, but newer challenge of hybrid threats, state threats against other states that are under the threshold of war, that are often executed covertly. They are designed not to leave traces. They are sometimes designed not to be detected when they materialize. How are you going to detect them before they materialize? So this it aggravates the already extremely challenging task of foreseeing threats that are not yet live. So we see a lot of the same issues, but I think the problem is getting worse.
One of the probably latest or most contemporary cases that we face is, of course, the assessment about Russia's intention to invade Ukraine. You contributed in a very interesting piece, Dan, to a special issue in Intelligence and National Security, which is the dedicated academic journal to the study of intelligence. You did publish a piece about the various assessments that were made by different countries between the United States, Britain, and the relationship with European intelligence agencies. The thing about this judgment, and talking about analysis as we were doing already, is that between a fine judgment or a right judgment and a wrong judgment, the difference between the two can literally be the difference between life and death. Or the difference between a right and a wrong judgment in this case is the ability to foresee a war or to simply miss it. So and now it's been exposed publicly and debated publicly, so that intelligence organizations seem to be more and more in the necessity to justify their assessments or to be present and justify their assessments in public debates and contribute through their assessments to public debates, through declassification processes, through strategic communication procedures. So how much do you think intelligence organizations, in building their assessments, are now more under the eyes of the public in making their assessment?
I think we're at something of a watershed moment, and I'm reminded, again, I always speak to students about this, back in 1994 there was a Director of Central Intelligence, James Woolsey, said, you know, we were in an age where we're in a jungle full of poisonous, a bewildering variety of poisonous snakes. And I think that situation has become much harder. We've got the traditional state-based threats, we've got non-state actors, and the terror threat has not gone away in the age of hybrid activity. You've got traditional espionage activity, you have kind of wider hybrid activity. You've also got the threat posed by non-state actors in the corporate sector, and then you've also got the challenge posed by open source. And I think one of the problems of secret intelligence is that some of the assessments can be verified in the open source and challenged by organizations like Bellingcat, who do very good all-source, open-source intelligence assessment. And I think that certainly post-2004, post-Butler, there has been a tendency, particularly in the UK, but certainly overseas, of justifying assessments, because the age where you could get the Prime Minister standing up in Parliament and saying, trust me, this is what the intelligence tells us, has long gone. Public trust in politicians, I'm afraid to say, is through the floor, and some of the polling that I've been looking at in this area shows that, particularly in the UK public perspective, there's 9-10% levels of trust in politicians. If you compare that to when you ask the public, do you trust the intelligence agencies, you're finding that, yes, there's an element of blind faith here, but there's a 60+% level of trust in intelligence officials saying stuff. And I think that means that the trend here is that governments and intelligence agencies have to be increasingly more open. That means you're going to have to potentially look at the open source and say, what can we declassify and mask behind the open source and put out there to justify and support some of the assessments that we're making. And I think that trend is going to continue as unfortunately we see the emergence of what Rand described a few years ago as truth decay and the problem of disinformation, or even the problem of wannabe OSINT people who, you go around on X and you can see really misleading judgments being put out there that seem to have thousands and thousands of likes and shares. And I think that there is always going to be a need for intelligence services to put information into the public sphere, use the careful caveats that we often use around language, but there is always need to do that. And there have been a number of good examples of that. So in 2018, the Skripal case in Salisbury, where a former British SIS agent had been poisoned by Russia's GRU. The British government actually put intelligence front and centre. So intelligence was made publicly available to show that this was a GRU hit job. We also saw that, I guess, following, in the lead up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where Defence Intelligence were releasing short updates, short videos to bring the public on side and to bring politicians along as well. And I think that trend is going to continue. We've seen the UK Ministry of Defence, even in response to the Iran crisis, provide its own regular updates and put them out on social media platforms. So I think it's going to be a major problem. Naturally, intelligence agencies cannot declassify everything, because if you declassify human, then there are real problems for source protection. But I think that you are having to increasingly justify your assessments to a broader public audience, because that's the space that we're living in these days.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to you all. Please join me again for thanking them, and thank you again for being a full room today. Thank you.